Let's get into it.
I think that's the plan.
Awesome. So before we can get into it, we should probably tell y'all who we are, introduce to some of you, and reintroduce to others that we already know. I'm Tamala Gresham.
I am Simon Mott, and we are Harmonize. We're the co-founders of Harmonize.
Yes. We've got professional backgrounds in organizing, education, law. We actually went to the same law school, go Bears, restorative justice, business, and organizational development.
We're students of liberation theology, critical race theory, Black feminism, sociology, somatics, mysticism, pretty much anything we can get our hands on. We are very much here for the woo and here for the groundedness. We also are very much here for joy. We like to say that we measure success in giggles per minute.
Mostly my giggling. We've been doing facilitation and org development work for nearly 30 years combined. And in our work, we both noticed the same problem. The way that humans work together isn't really working. It's recreating so many of the problems that we're actually trying to solve together.
So 6 years ago, we super teamed up to create Harmonize with a simple purpose to help people work together for the collective good. And in our process of helping people with all sorts of puzzles, from leadership structures to hiring processes to workflow management, culture, strategy, political education, and more, we came up with an approach that we call CODA, comprehensive organizational development, that we believe not only solves for surface problems, but also reaches deeper to address the root causes of breakdowns in liberatory collaboration. You can learn more about our whole CODA framework by viewing the webinar that we did last week. That's accessible on the website. You just click to register for it, and it'll take you right there.
All right, so what do we actually do? So we offer support in three primary forms. So first, we do coaching. So if you need one-on-one support inside of your organization, we help with that. We also do training, so large trainings inside of your organization or training smaller groups. And we also steward organizations. And that means us going into organizations and doing like long-term change processes or shorter-term change processes. But that's when we're really on the ground inside of those organizations with groups, helping them really do the thing.
Really,
And
any version of being a duck or a goose that's available.
the animal pictures have to like really give a
It's
theme,
great.
speak to what we're doing. But we do all of this, the coaching, training, and stewardship, all with the goal of aligning an organization's purpose, strategy, values, structure, culture, people, operations, really all the dimensions of an organization, with not only its deepest mission and values, but also we want to align it with the broader movement for the collective good. That's really what we're out here trying to do.
And as we've done this, we have noticed something pretty obvious, that sometimes the way that we're working together isn't really working, and that this creates conflict. We feel conflict in all sorts of ways. It could be unspoken tensions. It could be heated arguments, leaving people feeling disrespected or triggered. It could be spending tons of time on emotional processing and nervous system regulation that makes it hard to actually work together. It could be burnout, or it could be an inability to focus on relevant issues and solve problems together because we're so mired in whatever dynamics that we're inside of. And actually, it's more than just sometimes that this happens. It seems like some degree of conflict is present in most situations most of the time.
And that's because essentially conflict is the signal that the way we're working together isn't working.
So we need to figure out a way to meet this conflict, meet the fact that the way that we're working together isn't quite working, ideally in a way that helps support the overall vision of what we're trying to do, not just addressing the surface issue, but really being able to transform it into something positive. And in order to do that, we think there's kind of two basic things we need to be able to do. We need to be able to respond to conflict, which we call engagement, and we need to be prepared for conflict, which we call resilience. So we can, when conflict emerges, we can see it as kind of a problem or an opportunity. Engagement is the ability to unlock the opportunity hidden within conflict, and resilience is the ability to prevent it from becoming a disruptive problem to begin with.
And so, strong resilience and engagement practices, right, both of them will mean that when conflict happens for groups, they won't have to call someone like Harmonize because they'll already have a plan in place and they'll know what to do and they'll be able to engage conflict intentionally and directly. Right. But you can't really do one without the other, right? If you aren't really prepared, the way that you respond isn't going to go well. So you've got to be able to do both of them, both the resilience and the engagement. But right now, groups are struggling to do both of these. And so we help groups build conflict resilience and also successfully practice conflict engagement. We're actually, Simon, it's just occurred to me that we're working to put ourselves out of a job by teaching everyone to do this so they don't
That's
have
the
to.
goal.
That is definitely the goal.
But what is today? Why are you here? And what can you expect over the next 75 glorious minutes? Well, we're going to go over our overall approach to conflict. It's going to kind of be a little bit of a teaser of our overall framework, which is going to orient toward the shared ways of being, seeing, and working together that help us effectively meet conflict. And the real purpose of this info session right now is to invite you and yours to our conflict resilience courses. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll really have a firm understanding of what the upcoming courses are about and whether they're a good match for you and whether you want to participate in them. Additionally, as always, we just want to invite conversation and collaboration with people. Everybody here has your own conflict engagement resilience practices and wisdom, and we want to open up conversations so we can be a community that develops all of these things together.
100%. All right, so let's get into it. What is required to build conflict resilience and practice successful conflict engagement?
I don't know. Why don't you tell us?
Well, I think, Simon, we need a shared way of being, seeing, and working together.
I agree.
And we could make it a cute little image, like if an organization were a tree, like maybe those shared ways of being, seeing, and working together are then the branches that are really needed to create conflict resilience.
Can't believe you just came up with that.
Great. So if we can align these different ways of being, it's really going to help us prevent conflict and also respond to it better. So after more hours navigating different forms of conflict than I really truly care to remember, we've developed some ways of seeing, working together, and being that we find super useful. So first, we need a way of seeing. And by this, we mean the ability to see the underlying patterns and dynamics that are there and are able to create new possibilities, right? And so here, our core orientation is to the importance of possibility, right? And we need a map and a lens to find it. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. We also need a way of actually working together once we sort of see what the problem is. And this means shared practices, processes, and structures that are actually going to allow us to coordinate our activities successfully so we can actually work together. And we've grouped our key tools in this section into agreements and then tools, right? Because we got to agree on what we're going to use, and then we've got to be able to use them together in order to work together well. And then our last branch is our way of being. This means a way of navigating all the different complex thoughts and feelings of being a person in order to act in a situation, especially a tense situation that we're experiencing as conflict, right? Because then what's going on inside of our bodies is different than if I'm just having a coffee and I need to be able to like manage that as well. And so for this section, in terms of a way of being, we really focus on integrity and awareness. So that's our little treat. And now we're going to begin with a way of seeing. So we had possibility, our map, and our lens, and we're going to do a light tap on on these three areas. So you've got possibility, where we're going to talk about the nature of conflict, then our map, where we're going to get into our nested dimensions and Simon's favorite thing, which is concentric circles and fractals. And then we'll get into our lens, which is how we see things: power, belonging, and justice.
Put me on blast like that. That's
Take it away, Simon.
so possibility. So when we hear the word conflict, a lot of things might come up. And often there's a lot of negative stories that we have about conflict. Conflict is something that we don't want. It's hard. It leaves hurt feelings. It only occurs when things are going poorly or when someone's done something that isn't acceptable. There's a lot of these negative stories and negative feelings about it. But what we want to focus on is being able to create possibility, which isn't getting trapped in the negative stories about conflict. It's actually about changing the overall story and the overall understanding of what conflict is in order to be able to see the potential that is that's locked within it. And in order to kind of talk about this, we're going to share an example, from Harmonize, from our own conflict inside of our own little team here, put ourselves on display.
Names have been changed to protect the guilty and the innocent.
As if there were a difference. Yeah, so we're just going to want to be revealed about ourselves, not as perfect people, but as people who are actually practicing our own tools and developing them by navigating our own dynamics. So we'll thread this example throughout, but right now we want to use it to talk about the possibility within conflict. So just at a high level, what was happening? Well, there's Sona and Jennifer, and they're experiencing a lot of tension. And this makes it hard for them to interact with each other and often spilled over into substantive work conversations. We'd be talking about one thing, and all of a sudden we were inside of some dynamic. At a really high level, it was disagreements about workload, money, feeling seen and respected, and project management. But there were actually so many feelings and thoughts and frames flying around that it was hard for us to even sort out what was happening in a particular moment to focus on a task at hand or even be able to address the underlying dynamic. Sound familiar? Anybody been in one of those? Right. So we were experiencing that. Now, inside of that, there's one story that we could have used, which is Sona's hurting Jennifer, Jennifer's hurting Sonia. All the systems are broken that we're inside of. This is terrible. Woe to us. We just need to suffer through this, and we should just try to make somebody else feel wrong in order to feel slightly better about ourselves, which is actually like a story that many people consciously or subconsciously embody and enact when they're inside of a conflict. Something to notice about this story is it's actually not particularly useful, right? What the next chapter of the story probably isn't something that either Sonia or Jennifer are excited to live out. But we have a different story that arises from our understanding of what conflict is and our guiding metaphor for conflict, which is that conflict is like an earthquake. So we're experiencing an earthquake. When you're experiencing an earthquake, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of fear, it's a lot of chaos. There might actually feel like destruction and disruption and panic. It's not particularly a pleasant experience to be inside of right next to an earthquake for the most part. But earthquakes are what create mountains. And from that mountain, there's actually a new beauty and a new possibility and a new perspective that we can reach, that we can see different things. So the next story that we try to embody is we're experiencing an earthquake. There's friction and fear, but there's a mountain coming. Way more possibility.
All right, so Simon has done a lot of talking about the potential of like possibility inside of a conflict. But once we're at the top of that mountain, once we've ridden the earthquake up to the top, how do we actually get specific about locating and unlocking that possibility? And for that, we use our map of the nested dimensions of human connection. All right, and that's just a lot of words to say that we've created a map to show the scale of human connection and the different ways that we co-create and how those interrelate together. This map is super useful for lots of reasons, and it also helps us see the patterns of the different possibilities that exist at each level. You might be wondering, Tamara, what are you talking about? What are these levels? Let's get into them and take them one by one. All right. First, we've got that personal layer. And by this, we mean those individual beliefs, the way we embody those, and the way we act as individuals.
So in the context of conflict, this might be someone inside of a state of collapse or a state of trigger or inside of a trauma pattern that's making it hard for them to navigate their internal world in order to show up effectively to be able to collaborate.
So that's the personal layer. The next layer is the interpersonal level, which is where we start creating relationships between individuals.
And a conflict on this layer might be two people keep talking past one another, leaving themselves feeling misunderstood and unseen. Maybe somebody's a type A, maybe somebody's a type B, and it's just this personality and communication thing. It's really about the two of them figuring out how to work together.
Next up, we've got that organizational layer, which is where you have many individuals coming together, united with a common purpose. So basically, a group of relationships that, once they're together, create a whole new thing, right, with its own culture, structure, purpose, and more.
In an organization, for example, you might have unclear roles and unclear expectations. Maybe information is consolidated and inaccessible, and this is bringing people into relationships through those roles and expectations, and they're actually coming into friction because of those organizational features.
That one's always tricky. Then you've got the system level, right? Which is when many organizations solidify into a network that operates across an entire population.
And in conflict, this might look like a group, a nonprofit experiencing scarcity of money because of the whole grant making system that they're inside of. So maybe a project manager and a fundraiser come into conflict all the time, but the conflict is actually about how the organization is embedded and related to the nonprofit industrial complex as a whole. It's a system dynamic that the people are experiencing.
And then the next layer is ideological, which is those commonly held beliefs and stories that we carry in our minds and bodies within a society.
A conflict might emerge because one person is consciously or unconsciously trying to embody the form of leadership that's valued by patriarchy and showing up inside of all of these kind of toxic masculine embodiments. And what's actually happening inside the organization is people are wrestling with this archetype that's now present in the organization. Sounds fun.
Right. And then you've got the next layer, right, which is the world, which is our beautiful earth, right? The rock that we're hurtling through space on. Gotta love her. And then all the beings living and otherwise on the planet and our physical realities.
So in conflicts, for example, maybe there's someone who is living inside of a very congested city when they don't have the access to nature that would help them support feeling connected and belonging inside themselves and regulate their nervous system. They're feeling this generalized anxiety and disconnection. And then as they bring that in to a relationship, maybe a relationship that's mediated through pixels and Zoom, they're navigating that whole thing. So it's not just about the way that two people are relating, it's also about the way that they're positioned on Earth and whether that sets them up to be able to relate to each other well.
Then you said generalized anxiety. I was like, oh, that's me. All right. So then you've got the all layer, where we're talking about spirit, ancestral, cosmological, energetic, archetypal realms, and more, right? It's that space of I'm a Sagittarius and Simon is a Virgo, and sometimes my fire sign energy becomes really intense.
And that is a conflict, right? Fire, like the fire sign for earth sign. Or maybe, Mercury's always in retrograde. Or maybe there's kind of a generational and ancestral dynamic playing itself out. We navigate our different racial and ethnic heritages, and we're all inside of those stories. So sometimes it's actually like a white Jew, black woman thing going on.
And then our last layer, which is the source level, right? Which is that ineffable from which all really springs. It's hard to define, but you know what we're talking about.
And on a conflict layer, just the level of spiritual anchoring and direction that we all have in a particular moment really influences how we relate to everything else and ourselves.
All right. So those are our 8 nested layers of human connection, right? And we use this map to really start to understand the source of any friction that might be happening and the possibilities that are emerging within it. Because conflict can show up on all of these different dimensions all at once, right? And more often than not, that's what's happening. These dimensions are all happening at the same time. And then the dimensions themselves and the conflict itself on those dimensions are often created. They create on the other dimensions and they're created by the other dimensions. So there's a lot, just a lot going on. And so then seeing these layers and possibilities also helps us think about what shifts are necessary, right? So sometimes we need to shift a relationship on that interpersonal level in order to open up the possibility of shifting things on the organizational level. Or sometimes we need to shift an organizational dynamic in order to create an environment for someone to actually be able to make a shift on their personal level. And then if we zoom out farther, we can notice that in order to address some of the biggest system and ideological conflicts that we have, we're actually going to need to be able to address some of our most intimate personal, interpersonal, and organizational conflicts in order to be able to actually intervene at those larger scales.
I feel like that's a reason why we should talk about conflict resilience as part of an overall straight change strategy.
Oh my gosh, Simon,
Wow,
did you just come up with that?
thought of that. Um, but yeah, on each of these different layers, there's kind of different possibilities that show up when we focus on one or another. For example, if we really focus on that personal layer and making a shift there, we're usually going to unlock possibilities of personal growth, learning, and trauma repatterning. If we focus on that interpersonal layer, we're usually going to get deepened trust, communication, understanding. On an organizational layer, we're going to end up with new structures, new policies, and new practices. And then through the systems ideological world, all in source layers, things get a little bit more complex. But just generally speaking, when we focus there, we develop a new analysis and awareness of what's going on in the world and around us that allows us to access new practices for how we relate to those levels and relate to one another.
Simon, I think that people need an example.
Oh, should we share our own drama in visceral
Air our
detail?
dirty laundry in the streets
Yes,
always.
let's do that.
Okay, so what did the nested map of our example look like? All right, so where we have Sonia and Jennifer who are struggling to work together. So again, at a high level, right, there were all these disagreements about workload, money, feeling seen and respected, and project management and interpersonal relationships. And we were getting caught in our feelings, and things were like really out of control, and we couldn't focus on the task at hand, right? And that's when we pulled out this trusty map to help us actually see what's happening in more detail so that we can be intentional about our choices. So let's start with that first layer, that personal layer. So what we saw is that one person was navigating the journey of sitting in their own power, coming into that. And another person was navigating a journey inside of themselves of finding their own sense of value and belonging. On the interpersonal level, in terms of the relationship between Sonia and Jennifer, the two were experiencing breakdowns in trust, in communication, and emotional safety inside of their close personal friendship. Then we looked at the organizational level, right? Because it's more than just what's going on personally and between the two and inside of their relationship. At our organizational level, our roles and workflows, the way they were working, were creating many moments of just unclarity that set the two up to step on each other's toes or overwrite each other's work, which then started escalating all of the other layers. On the system level, things were also happening. So one was navigating an acute need for stable income to support themselves and their family in the immediate term, right? Which you can see how that would ripple across the organizational layer and how that person feels about their role and the workload, and then their personal relationship with that person, and then inside of themselves trying to find their own power. On the system layer for the other person, they were navigating the need to establish legitimacy inside of academia, right, which is a system in itself. They were both doing this as Black women in the world. So there are lots of layers on that systemic thing that's happening for the two of them. Then you've got that ideological layer, right, where we're talking about those collective beliefs. So one of them had a strong value for comprehensive academic rigor and clear structure. So everything we approach has to be approached from that direction. Whereas the other person had a strong value for iteration, taking small pieces at a time and responding to in the moment needs. And those different ideological ideas pitted them against each other. Then on our world layer, right, on a planetary level, there were many interactions that were occurring on Zoom while both of them were living in cities experiencing like significant turmoil. And then on that all and source layer, so for all, one was a fire sign. Wow, just out me. And the other was an earth sign. And sometimes, Mercury's in retrograde, and that's creating problems for everyone. And then on that source layer, everyone sort of coming at it from their own space, right? They are where they are in terms of how they relate to the ineffable and the source and where their deepest connection to the energy of life is. Ooh, there was so much going on.
It was
So
so
how
fun. So fun. So we were just chilling. It was great.
yes. Simon, should we pause and ask people if they have any questions about this map before we move into our
Sounds,
lens?
sounds like a great idea.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So what we just shared is our nested map of human connections, which is what we use to sort of go into a situation and figure out, okay, where is all of the conflict stemming from, right? Where are the sources of that so that we can then get a better map of what's going on so we know how to move. Are there any questions about this map, any of the layers, how we use it?
Or reactions.
Any reactions like, oh, yeah, this is cool. I think like this too. Or are you thinking about different conflicts that you might have had and thinking through, oh, we were actually having a conflict around an organizational thing and we were only thinking about it on the personal level, something like that. You can use the Q&A function or you can throw something in the chat as well. Yes, thanks, Adam. All right, we got another person who loves a nested model. Simon, friends. More people who love concentric
And
circles.
Sulu for sure. We're gonna kind of go into all of that, how people react and the different choices that we have
Mhm.
inside of it. It's the concentric circuses. I'm going with circuses.
Yes.
We're taking it. Concentric circuses. Thank you for the contribution. Thank you, everyone, for chatting with us. Okay,
And
so
then there's one person who says they don't have any questions, but I relate to the astrological signs of Mercury being in retrograde. I'm glad we're not alone out here. Love that.
cool. So then after we see what's going on, there's all these different layers. Well, how do we address it? How do we locate the possibility? Well, one of the things that we do is we look at what we consider the fundamental forces that underlie collaboration, which we think of as power, belonging, and justice. So, power is the ability to make choices and exert influence on the self or others. Belonging is the state and experience of safety and legitimacy when using power in groups, as well as access to the abundance created by a group's use of power. And justice is the creation of dignity and true choices for all people and all beings through both the repair of the historical misuses of power and also the ongoing rearrangement of power and belonging. So we look at power, which is like who's doing what and how are we creating? Belonging, which is how are we really creating together and who's in and who's out and how do people feel about that? And then justice, which is are we creating actually harmony and are we creating what we really want? We'll look at how those things are operating on each level and across the different levels to be able to start to understand how we might be able to intervene. And that lets us ask questions like, where do we start and what will have the most impact? And this whole process of being able to understand how things exist at these different levels, and then ask critical questions to be able to understand what order we should approach everything in order to be able to unlock possibilities on all of the different levels. And that's something that we're going to go way more into in the upcoming courses. In particular, in course 1, there's going to be a little bit of a section on it. And then course 3, which is the conflict mindsets masterclass, we're going to have a whole hour and a half just on this idea. How do you meet a conflict, understand what's going on, and then as somebody inside of it or somebody facilitating it, make strategic decisions about what you do. But at a high level, kind of coming back to our own little example, on a personal level, Sonia and Jennifer did some self-reflection in order to create more opportunities for how they had to relate to their own power, because there was their own sense of power and agency was impacting the whole thing. But then on an interpersonal layer, we had to notice that Sonia and Jennifer's interpersonal relationship, was actually an anchor of belonging for them in their bodies and inside of our group. So the disruption in the relationship was influencing their sense of belonging and place all around, and that was showing up in all of these different other places inside of the organization, inside of the dynamic. Then on an organizational layer, we noticed that actually the unclear roles and workflows were creating moments where the power conflicts happen, which exacerbated the other levels and unsettled belonging. So now that we kind of started to see that that's how it was based, power and belonging were really operating, we had to figure out how to titrate between these 3 different layers of intervention that we thought were the most important. We had to do enough personal stuff so that Sonia and Jennifer could show up to the interpersonal thing in a slightly different way, and to be able to show up in the organizational, to be able to make an organizational shift. But there were actually times where we tried too hard to make organizational shifts without dealing with the personal shifts. So we would come up with a fancy new system and it wouldn't do anything because it didn't actually address the personal or interpersonal layers sufficiently. It was lots of fun.
All right. So why does a shared way of seeing matter so much, right? Like, we've taken the time to talk to you about these 3 tools, the nature of conflict, the nested dimensions map, and power, belonging, and justice. But why does that really matter? Why do we even feel like it's a contribution unique enough to be considered its own special approach and to ask you to come here on a Tuesday for an hour and a half, right, to hear about it? Well, that's because there are a lot of really great like conflict work and approaches out there, like restorative justice or nonviolent communication. And these tools, really, the tools that we're talking about, help us notice that these approaches often fall into 3 different pitfalls. So, one, they only address 1 or 2 of these levels, like the personal or the interpersonal and maybe the organizational level, right? Or they don't work on the root or core dynamics that are happening. And 3, they can often subtly prioritize certain forms of resolution. Which is why a conflict process might result in people feeling seen and heard, but actually still existing in a toxic organization. That can happen when we're focusing a lot on the personal and interpersonal layer, but not the organizational layer and any structures that might exist there. You might have changes in roles and policies, but continued distrust. That can often happen when we focus too much on that organizational level and shifting our agreements, but not really attending to the personal or interpersonal or people or that ideological level. Then you can have shared political analysis, right? Do all the work to build that and still have no ability to actually change your circumstances. And that can often happen when we're focused on that ideological layer, where we're really trying to do political education, but we aren't empowering groups in a systems level or an organizational level to actually be able to move and shift things tangibly. And so that is why this way of seeing and our tools are really embedded throughout our whole approach, because we think it's more comprehensive and holistic and is actually more likely to get you to the top of that mountain where you can see all of the different possibilities and make a different choice and adapt and evolve your organization to keep moving forward.
And if you're interested in that,
How to do that.
if you're interested in that, Yeah, so that's kind of what our courses are about. We're this year we're rolling out three courses. The first one is about building conflict resilient organizations. And that's going to be a light touch on those ways of seeing that we just went over, but it's going to go way deeper into how do you actually embed those ways of seeing into organizational processes and practices that allow you to be resilient in the face of conflict and to engage conflict well. Then when we get into course two, that's going to be specific tools for specific moments in conflict engagement. What do you do when something first starts to surface? What do you do when there's two people in conflict? What do you do when it's a messy dynamic between three different people? All of that. And so there's going to be specific tools, and these ways of seeing are embedded inside of all of those tools to help people get in that mindset so they can find new choices. Then in course number three, we're going to go really way deeper into what we just talked about, these ways of seeing, which is really looking at how do you analyze conflict in order to be able to see possibilities and then move strategically with respect to all of those. And you can see the dates that they're on there.
Awesome. Are there any questions about our ways of seeing that we've gone into PBJ, especially since we just tapped on that since we last asked you if you had any questions? So are there any questions about PBJ or our conflict resilience course series before we move into our next branch?
And we'll keep returning to kind of all of these different courses as we go, and we'll add and at the very end we'll have time to answer a lot of specific questions about what we offer. And yes, we do support with redrafting policies and practices. And if you're interested in that, the course one, if you're like, I want to think about redrafting our policy, course one is all about that. And then you can sign up for additional coaching with that, or you could hit us up directly, and we work also just directly with organizations. But we're hoping that the courses are actually like a more efficient and affordable way for people to be able to get the work.
Basically, you can get all 4 sessions for what would be 1 hour of one of our time. So one coaching hour, or you can take a course.
Cool.
We used to be school teachers, so we've got to take that beat for questions. And then I all right, great. All right. So, in order to actually unlock the possibility of conflict and to prevent it from creating problems to begin with, we're going to need more than a way of seeing. We'll also need a way to actually work together. And so, by this, we mean our shared practices, processes, and structures that allow us to coordinate our activities successfully. So basically, we have to agree first to how, why, and when and where to apply our tools. So we've got a group of agreements, and then we've got a group of tools that we want to share as a part of our way of working together. And so when we're talking about agreements, we're going to get into our conflict preparedness policy. And then in terms of tools, we have an entire tool set for conflict resilience. And so the basic frame that you want to think through in terms of why does an organization need to build resilience and successfully practice conflict engagement, you've got resilience, right? And that is, those agreements are how we create resilience, right? We want to agree ahead of time, like that's how we prepare for conflict. And then tools are what we use to actually engage conflict and respond to it well.
And we build our whole model off of this 5-step process that comes from the somatic psychological work of Ray Castellino. And it says that we move through these 5 phases of action anytime we're kind of going through a change process. We set intentions, we prepare, we take actions, we follow through, and then we integrate. Setting intention is figuring out what is my underlying goal and motivation. What am I really trying to do here as I engage? Preparing is how do I need to organize myself, my thoughts, and my body to get myself ready to actually be able to move in alignment with that intention that I set. Taking action is how do I engage with the outside world to take action in alignment with that? Then after I take action, I need to actually complete the action and do the thing fully by following through. And then after I follow through, I need to integrate. Notice that I've gone through that process. I'm now in a different place than I was before. And recenter and be prepared to do something again. So this flow of intention, preparation, action, and follow through is the way that we organize everything inside of our conflict, our conflict approach. And when we look at the conflict preparedness policy, we use that system to organize it. So when we're thinking about conflict preparedness policy, the intentions are what we include things like, what are your organization's underlying values? What are your orientations to conflicts and your beliefs about conflict? When we're preparing for conflict, well, what do you do before it even emerges? What are the trainings that you do and the relationship building before a conflict happens? Then the actions, there's two basic sets of actions that we think about. One is, what do you do for an everyday conflict that can be kind of navigated and engaged with people informally? And then that next level of conflict, which is, what do you do when something requires a formal organizational response? Then after that, how do you implement the agreements that you make through that engagement process and integrate? How do you learn and evolve and recenter after the engagement? Thing to emphasize here is that a lot of people, when they think of their conflict engagement policies, the only parts that are included is really that B part of action, which is, what do we do when it's a formal organizational process? Sometimes they'll throw a little bit of intentions and values in there, but to really be prepared for conflict, to be resilient and to be able to engage successfully, we think we need all 5 of these things and to be centered and have an organizational practice of that. And that's what the conflict preparedness policy is about. It's a written record of what your organization does to build resilience and engage conflict. The reasons why I think it's really useful: first, it creates a scaffold for everything else that you already know about conflict. You probably already know something about intentions around conflict. You probably already have practices of how you prepare for conflict. You already have practices and orientations for all of these things. But by creating this scaffold, you can fit in what already works for you and understand where you might not have something in order to be able to create a holistic process. And that holistic process establishes a shared foundation. So anytime conflict happens, people get triggered, people get worried, things are escalated, it's nice to have a shared foundation to come back to and ground. And as you're having conversations and navigating things throughout the course of your organization, you're talking about how you want to be with conflict, it's really nice to have a vehicle to ground conversations, record them, and to be able to support your organization by building that piece of infrastructure. And that is really what Course 1 is all about. Course 1's focus is about building conflict preparedness policies. So we'll talk about all of these different things, and as we move through the phases, you'll get templates and examples of things like the value statements and conflict belief statements. We'll go over different versions of preparation, for example, hygiene conversations, feedback sessions, how hiring and onboarding influences conflict resilience. We'll go into actions, so there'll be supports like sentence starters and one-on-one conversation tools, as well as a whole hour-and-a-half long session on processes for the 4 types of escalated conflicts that we think often require organizational intervention, which are escalated conflicts, grievances, polarizing issues, and performance issues. And we'll also talk about follow-through with templates and support teams and how to integrate through debrief sessions. So that's really conflict. Like, course number 1 is about how do you create this policy.
And Simon, if folks are thinking, oh, I'm going to come to this course and learn about how to create this policy, but what do I do if I have specific questions about what to do inside of my organization? Is there any coaching available for that?
There is, Tamala. What a great question. Yeah, so you can what we try to do is make the course super affordable. So there's four hour-and-a-half long sessions, and you get a whole bunch of templates, and it's $350. And then on top of that, there's community coaching, which are small groups of participants will all meet with us to be able to talk about questions that came up. It's kind of like a lecture and then group discussion model. And then if you want more support, we do personal coaching. So you can bring your organization and we'll work directly with your organization. So if you're sitting here thinking, wow, I really just want a new policy for my organization, the best move is to do the course and do the personal coaching. That way we offer you the tools, all of that thing, and then we talk specifically about your circumstance, what works for you, and how to implement that.
So private coaching options and community coaching options. All right. Are there any questions about any of that? Course one or conflict preparedness policy or the different phases of conflict? Okay. So Ingrid says, I'd love to hear your thoughts about helping individuals and orgs actually identify and name conflict. What have we found most helpful there? That's a really good one. Sam, do you want to save that till the end when we get to it? Or do you want to tackle it now?
Oh, I want to go to the next slide.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Ingrid, we're going to come back to that. That's a
Oh yeah.
fabulous.
Well, the next slide has it.
Oh my gosh.
Look at that,
Ingrid,
Ingrid.
not a
Such a great plan. So the course two is really about all of these specific tools for very specific moments that occur inside of conflicts. And this moment of like, hang on, how do I name a conflict? How do I even start a conversation about this thing? Like, how do I start a conversation about something I don't really know what it is? Or how do I make sense of it? How do I use, what do I do? That's a moment inside of conflict. And our tools actually are specific things to help with specific moments of that. So what the question that you're talking about is like identifying and naming a conflict. The two things that we use for that are first the nested dimensions conflict map, which is something that we'll go into in course two for like a whole hour and a half. Just how do you do that thing? And that's really supportive. Another thing that is relevant is we have our conversation guides, which are one-on-one conversation guides for different types of moments and in conflict. So sometimes you got to give somebody feedback. Sometimes you got to explore a dynamic with somebody. And sometimes you just don't really know what's going on, but you know you need to talk to somebody about something. So how do you navigate those different moments in ways that are generative, that feed back into that overall process of intention, preparation, action, follow through, integration? So we have tools for all of those different things. And that's kind of the point of those sessions. And you can see here that these are specific tools that are intended for specific moments in the engagement process, which for all of the nerds keeping track, inside of the action step of the big thing, all the 5 steps repeat themselves. Anytime I decide that I'm going to talk to somebody and engage something, I then reset my intention, prepare for that specific moment, take an action, follow through, and integrate. So we have things like self-reflection guide, conflict map, one-on-one guides, bunch of organizational intervention stuff, templates, integration guides, things like that.
Simon, is there more you want to say about this before we move to questions?
Nope.
Awesome. So we've got another question from Eleanor, where they say, do you think that the learnings and transformations from this will be valuable even if there is staff turnover among those who participate? So I know you're saying that there are a lot of tools that we'd be able to hold on to, but I wonder if the learning would be harder to transfer from one human to another. Smiley face.
With respect to the first course, 100% absolutely worth it, because it's really about building an organizational policy that isn't about any specific person. Obviously, the people who go through it, if they stay, the better they'll understand it, the more agency they'll have in creating it. That's great. The second course, I do think it would still be useful, even if there is turnover, because what'll happen is you'll be able to skill up everybody in the organization and create this common tool set. Then you'll have all the tools and you'll have all the recordings. So part of your onboarding process for the new people can be like, here's a tool and here's a recording. Let's talk about it together. You'll have that kind of ongoing. And then for course 3, that's really about like personal work. It's really about a lot of self-reflection about how each individual orients toward conflict. So I think it's probably still worthwhile to up-level whoever's there and develop whoever's there, but that's going to be like less juicy than the first 2. But the first 2, I think, are still going to be like awesome, even if there's going to be a bunch of turnover.
And that hiring and onboarding portion is going to be really key to help bring new people on. All right. Awesome. Next. What
Back.
did we?
What did we do? We moved through it simply and elegantly. Obviously, we just did the best we could. So we use hygiene sessions. That was a big practice for us. And hygiene sessions are kind of like regular times to tend to smaller dynamics. And we use those things successfully for a while to build our culture and to be able to open up vulnerability and be able to practice ways of speaking and listening to one another. But as the conflict escalated, it actually couldn't exist inside the hygiene sessions anymore. And the hygiene sessions, instead of being an hour and a half, were just blowing up into these shenanigans that made no one really that happy. So we had to stop that, stop using the hygiene sessions to be able to process this stuff that was happening. And then we leaned into self-reflection and one-on-one tools. And that's what allowed people to start making shifts internally to approach each other differently. And then the one-on-one tools allowed us to start having one-on-one moments and find what repair was possible and alignment was possible inside of those one-on-one relationships and where the limits of those things were. And we actually didn't get through it with all of those. We actually had to find a deeper shift on our way of being in order to be able to find that. And that's what we'll talk about in a minute.
Well, let's not keep the people waiting too long.
Oh my
So
God.
I think our agreements and tools for conflict engagement, that way of working together, are super useful. But at the end of the day, we are individual human beings using these ways of seeing and working together. So we also need a way of being, right? And have that be shared among us. That's going to help us, that's going to support us to use all of these approaches well. And so, a way of being is a way of navigating the thoughts and feelings of our own personal human experience. It's a way of relating to all of the various impulses and stimulation that we feel. And we have to have the skills and be prepared to actually engage conflict as individuals. And so we group this into awareness and integrity. Those are the things that we focus on in terms of the shared ways of being we want to have with each other. And in terms of integrity, where we anchor there is a concept called teshuva that Simon will explain. And then awareness is our map of the self. Ready, Simon?
Into the woo. So let's first think about the way of being. So you can imagine Jennifer being inside of a way of being, which is a way of orienting toward her thoughts and her feelings and experience that produces a story like this. She says, Sonia is so arrogant and disrespectful. I can't work with her until she realizes that she's wilding out, apologizes, and commits to behavior change. And at the same time, Sonia is out here embodying a similar way of being that results in a story that's like, Jennifer is so incompetent and hypervigilant. I can't work with her until she realizes that she's wilding out, apologizes, and commits to behavior change. So these are common ways of being that people orient to when things get escalated. But what we want to really notice about them is that both of these people have given the power and responsibility to the other one. They say, I can't do something until that other person does something. And neither of them are actually oriented to the new possibilities available inside of themselves, regardless of what changes outside of them. So it's an incredibly limiting way of being because we're pretty narrow. Our power's outside of ourselves. We're both kind of subtly casting ourselves as a victim in a situation. There's not really a lot of moves that can happen there. You can imagine that what's going to happen is these people are going to get together and basically argue about who's right and who's wrong, and it's just going to make them more convinced that the other one's wrong. It's like suboptimal. How are we going to change that? Well, the way that we describe this shift is centering teshuva as our core intention. And teshuva derives from a Jewish idea that there's always a misalignment between our ideal self and who we are in a moment. There is some ideal perfect self that's great that we could theoretically be, but we never actually are that. There is always a gap between our ideal self and who we actually are, which isn't a shame thing. It's actually ideally kind of liberating because it implies two things. First, it's completely normal to miss the mark. It's completely normal to fall short of who we want to be. And this is important because oftentimes the ways that conflict emerges and the ways we hit each other, make each other feel hurt or harm each other is because we've missed the mark in some way. But it's normal for us to miss the mark. It's inevitable for us to miss the mark. So we don't need to feel blame. We don't need to feel shame. It's just a thing that occurs as a feature of being human. And by understanding this, we see that noticing how we've missed the mark is actually an opportunity to deepen our alignment with who we truly want to be. So it doesn't, if I miss the mark and do something and I hit Tamala and Tamala comes back and makes that point to me, like you did this thing. It's not, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible person. It's like, oh, well, of course I mess up sometimes. Thank you for telling me that. Thank you for believing in me that I would take that well. And I will make some shift inside myself. It's the same as like, if you're really my friend, tell me I got something in my teeth. Right?
Looking alive.
So how does this work? So if both Sonia and Jennifer embody this, they start to have a different story, which is I'm working through really hard feelings. I'm likely contributing somehow to this dynamic. I can find new choices in how I relate to this situation, regardless of the choices that the other person makes. Notice this is entirely different as a framework because it's recentering both of them in their own power and their own agency, and is encouraging them to seek possibilities, not only for the situation, but for themselves. I can make this, it's saying the situation is revealing to me an opportunity for me to learn something about myself, to make a new choice, to deepen my alignment with who I really want to be. I can do that regardless of whether or not the other person joins me. And if I do it, it usually encourages the other person to do it and helps us actually find a new pathway because we're centered in our own agency. Now, teshuva is a complex concept with much history, and I hope at some point I can nerd out about it with all of you. But one really simple way to understand what it does is how it reframes the concept of integrity. So sometimes people think of integrity as alignment between your values and actions. Integrity isn't perfect alignment between values and actions, because as long as we exist in this muddy, complex world with histories of colonization and capitalism and racism that we have been born into, there's no way to be in perfect alignment with between values and actions. If I was actually in perfect alignment with my values, I wouldn't be using this computer that was created by the very capitalist system that I'm currently trying to reimagine by talking to people through the computer. I can't be in perfect alignment. So instead, integrity is really about a good faith and rigorous wrestling with where we're out of alignment. It's not saying, oh my gosh, I'm perfect. It's saying, I understand that I'm out of alignment and I'm going to lean into that as a way of continuously deepening my alignment. Why does that matter?
Well, Simon.
Why would that even be useful?
Oh my gosh. It can have such a big difference in the dynamics that we are experiencing, right? So first, it will center people in their own power and responsibility. Can you believe it, Simon?
I love it.
So that way, the question isn't, what did that other person do wrong? It's, where did you miss the mark? Where did I miss the mark? And what do I want to do about that? And this really short circuits that blame game, right? Now we're not going back and forth. And it often makes it easier for people to proactively take responsibility for the things that bothered the other person anyway. Then it also reframes feedback as the gift that it is. There is no gotcha moment. There's no other shoe that's going to drop. Everyone knows that everyone misses the mark. There's no shame in that. So pointing out that this happened is basically like what Simon was saying earlier. You've got food in your teeth, or Tamala, one of your curls is like risen out. It's saying, hey, I know that you are a great person, but you did this thing that wasn't so great. So I want to let you know because I believe in you and I believe that you want to be the person who lives in alignment with what you say your spoken values are. Then, as we do this, we also increase our humility and our empathy, right? So now we're not throwing stones, right, anymore, because everyone comes to the party knowing that they too live in a glass house. We're in this glass house together, right? And we can all have some patience and tenderness with each other because sometimes conflicts force us all to really confront patterns inside of ourselves that we might not be ready for or that we might not have the support necessary for in the moment. And so, if we each really honor each other's journeys inside of that, we have to then understand that coming into alignment in some of these places is really hard. And we need to artfully balance honoring someone else's needs and pacing and honoring our own needs and pacing and our organization's boundaries. And this is my personal favorite part of why Teshuva matters, that it really opens up possibilities that don't require complete agreement about stories or emotional intimacy. So it takes us out of that space where I'm fighting to get this other person to see it the way I do, right? Because if we hinge Sonia and Jennifer's future on whether they each agree with the other's characterization of them and all of the facts, then we're likely going to be in it for a lot of hours and litigating facts and justifying conclusions, which is hard when you're in a room with a bunch of lawyers. Okay. So,
Oh no, we're
and
lawyers. You just outed us.
we told them that at the
Oh,
beginning.
perfect. Put them down low. We're trying to be all.
And, and we are likely going to be in competition, right? Where neither really wants to give an inch. And so instead, we can short circuit that whole thing. And we can say, okay, Sonia, let's say you're right. And Jennifer is arrogant and disrespectful. Who do you want to be in relationship to Jennifer, Sonia? Do you want to be the kind of person that characterizes her behavior in that way? What are your reactions to the situation, inviting you to consider about yourself? And from there, we're able to integrate this into our approach through things like reflection guides and other tools that Simon mentioned to really help people get into this frame.
Let's keep scooting along for how you actually do this by developing awareness and leave questions for the end.
I love it. I love it.
Cool. So, how do you actually unlock these possibilities to understand how to be in alignment with who you really want to be? Well, first, you have to be aware of the self that we are being in order to understand where we're out of alignment. So, lucky for us, we have concentric circles again. So, there's a lot of ways to understand like what the self is. We've distilled this thing that we think is kind of simple and useful inside of organizational contexts right now, which is a simple concept that there's a core self, which is this well of potential that's the sovereign experience of who we really want to be. That's the core self. Then there's a vulnerability field, and that's where we carry both our wounds as well as the openness to true interdependency with one another. And then outside of that, there's a protective field, which is all of the strategies and patterns that we use to prevent our vulnerability fields from getting hurt. So basically the game is to be able to access our core selves so that we can navigate our vulnerabilities intentionally and not operate from wounds, and to be aware of these protective mechanisms that we've developed over time, to be able to inquire into whether or not that form of protection is appropriate for this particular circumstance. Sometimes we do need to protect ourselves, but oftentimes we're protecting unconsciously in a way that actually isn't tuned into the
moment.
the moment. And we use, and this big scaffold kind of sets us up to be able to go deeper in two different ways through. Yeah, I guess that was part of the presentation. On the next slide, we'll see that that there's two different ways that we usually use this tool and go deeper. One is somatic awareness, and one is parts awareness. So somatic awareness is really like a body-centered way into this world, which is thinking about the nervous system states and common reactive patterns that arise out of nervous system states, how to understand what nervous system regulation is, and the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic nervous system, and okay. And then there's parts awareness, which is a little bit more of a mind framework. Obviously, mind and body are not separate, but it's a little bit more of a mind way in, which is saying what part of us is steering the ship at any moment. There's all of our ages continue to exist inside of us at every moment? Has our inner 12-year-old started to steer the ship? And also, what other like social scripts are playing out that create roles that we try to embody? So this lets us kind of understand what's going on and creates a language for us to be able to start talking about it. How did this work in our organization? Well, therapy. Um, at some point, we actually realized that all of our various strategies for dealing with the conflict were growing out of protectors and wounds. There were these subconscious ideas about what resolution really looked like, and it was limiting us. So we were all kind of focused on like, well, we have to be really good friends at the end, or it has to look like this distribution of power and labor, or this distribution of whatever. And there was a lot of fear of saying something that would cast that would bring up a past feeling for one another, and it was making us all way more narrow than we needed to be. And once we developed more awareness of the way that our protectors and our wounded parts were actually running the show, we were able to move from our core selves and be able to find new solutions. I mean, Sonia and Jennifer, uh, we were all able to move from our core selves and find new solutions. And actually, it ended up with Jennifer reducing their hours and being supported to create a new project. And the important thing is everybody was actually stoked at the end of this. It might, if were stuck inside of our old frameworks and our old way of being and our own wounded parts and protectors, we would have saw this as a failure. But because we were able to move out of it, we understood that these radical reshaping of our relationships and agreements with one another actually created an environment that was better for all of us. And we were able to make this thing moving from a much deeper place.
Yay.
Yay. So chill. It was so chill. Um, so you might be thinking, I want to learn more. And if you are, there are courses. So again, that first course, Building Conflict Resilient Organizations, is really about that conflict preparedness policy. It's perfect for people who are in charge of some level of organizational development and they want to create a new policy for their organization to be able to act within. And in that course, you'll get a bunch of tools, little one-pager tools. And then in course 2, we're going to go deeper into what those things are. And it's going to be really like a whole hour and a half on one-to-one conversations, a whole hour and a half on nested conflicts, a whole hour and a half on our more politically precise evolution of nonviolent communication, a whole hour and a half on how to have conversations about issues that people polarize around, all these different tools, a whole hour and a half on grievance templates and how the grievance processes work. Then in course 3, we're going to go deeper into the mindsets. So again, like a whole hour and a half on Teshuvah, a whole hour and a half on the map of the self and how we navigate through that. And that's really more of a like kind of individual professional development course. It's great for a group to take. But if you think of them like this, course 1 is about creating organizational infrastructure. Course 2 is about creating tools that people can use inside of an organization to navigate things. And course 3 is really about how people show up for that whole process.
And course 1 starts on April 2nd. Course 2 for the tool starts on May 28th. And then our conflict mindsets masterclass starts on September 17th. And at any time, you can hit us up for any coaching, training, or stewardship inside of your organization with respect to things like acute conflict, building policies and practices, developing other skills, and really any of your organizational development needs. Simon, you want to tell the people how to go full nerd?
If you'd like to go full nerd, yeah, you can learn more about conflict resilience and how it fits into our overall CODA framework and our vision for harmony by watching the Intro to CODA webinar, which some of you were already at, which is so touching. Thank you for hanging out with us. But you can go on our website and register for it there, and that'll give you access to the recording.